Hello, Council Bluffs Area Chamber of Commerce members. This is Drew Camp, President and CEO of the Council Bluffs Area Chamber of Commerce, here with our February 17th, 2023 weekly legislative update video. The first place we'll start is with the major issue needing to be handled for the rest of the session, which is property tax. This week, we saw the rollback bill that's supposed to fix that 1.8% rounding error or calculating error that the IDR and other state agencies happen to make with the residential rollback. It equates to about $133 million in projected municipal revenue. That's now headed to the governor's desk. So it does give cities a little bit more time to plan as to how they're going to absorb that within their budgets. For us here in Council Bluffs, it's between $800,000 and $1 million in impact for the projected income that was the city was looking at for FY 2024, which is the budget they're currently working on. So they will have to go back to the drawing board and kind of figure out where they're going to make up that money. We also saw Senator Dawson's bill get moved forward. What that bill does with regards to property tax, and what that bill does is it caps levy rates, and it's an initial step to reform property tax system for the multiple year approach that they're going to be taking, as we've talked about all session. What it really does is it is a budget limitation bill and caps all levies to create one large levy and caps it at 2.5% total growth annually. One thing that you kind of look at and think maybe needing to be considered, and one thing that's great about working with Senator Dawson is he's always willing to listen to these kinds of things. So these are the kinds of things that we need to be talking about. How can we possibly associate these pieces to the bill? Because obviously it's still very early in the stages, and this is the time we want to be making these recommendations. Is maybe consider having it tied to some inflationary pressure or measure, such as the CPI or whatever is deemed most appropriate. But obviously with the times we're living in and the inflationary pressures that we're seeing, that might be something we want to look at considering, and then potentially looking at some growth metrics that ties it to how a community is growing. That's something that some experts in that area will need to sit down and figure out. But those are a couple things that we may want to consider looking at as we look at how this bill is going to transition through the Senate Ways and Means Committee and then onto the Senate floor, and then ultimately over to the House Ways and Means Committee. And it's our understanding that Representative Kaufman, who chairs the House Ways and Means Committee, is kind of waiting to see what happens with this bill, have it come over, and then take it from there as far as how the House will handle this bill proposal, really kind of letting the Senate lead on it. Because as we know, the two big issues for the Senate were the educational choice and property tax. So understandably so, Representative Kaufman is kind of taking Senator Dawson's lead on this. One thing that we will do is obviously with Senator Dawson, fortunately being our local senator, we'll continue to work with him as to how we might be able to get such things as some of these growth measures put in there and just have conversations of how we can best make this bill work for all parties involved, obviously public and private. But one of the biggest things we'll do as a chamber is obviously be a great intermediary between the city and other private partners to make sure those discussions are had in a civil and productive manner. With regards to energy issues, we saw a couple bills move this week. One of them is regarding EV charging, and really what it would look at doing is kind of limiting utilities from putting infrastructure into businesses like Hy-Vee, Casey's, Come and Go, and other facilities that have large parking, large areas, and a big customer demographic that would be possibly needing those. So we'll wait and see what comes of that bill. But one thing, obviously, with Mid-Am and our utility partners being a major supporter and a key partner of ours, we always like to look at how we can work alongside them. We also look at these innovative rates and how we can support potentially in unison with our energy partners, Mid-American and others throughout the state. This issue is something we think will make us more competitive, not only on a state, but national level as well. And we really hope that we can continue to push this issue forward and working with the Iowa Chamber Alliance, PDI, and other key partners. One group that's obviously kind of important that we're kind of waiting on is the Iowa Utilities Board on this issue. With regards to the MEGA program and this new proposal and for the creation of a new program under Iowa Economic Development Authority for these large $1 billion+ projects, subcommittees are being scheduled. There's still a lot of work to do to move it forward and figure out how we can possibly make this work. The great news is obviously Debbie and her team are very dynamic in this area and how they can figure out working with the governor and the legislature to move this along, but also working with us in the economic development and chamber world as to how we can help advocate and tell stories as to how this can best be implemented into law and then also utilized. There's also a technical bill which includes things like angel investor tax credits, the sunsetting of innovation tax credits, and some other key programmatic pieces within Director Durham's budget. And that's something that we're really looking at and trying to push as well. The one thing is with these major issues we've seen come up in the legislature, there is kind of a really regimented approach that we've seen the legislature take. So we really just have to make sure we're keeping these things on their radar to help move them forward into the end of session here in the last few months. With regards to the ESG bill, this is really the piece that you're seeing with regards to the choices of investments that the state makes for specifically, obviously, just state investments. One thing to watch specifically and very closely is Senator Busolo is kind of really running this bill, and he's keenly aware of it needs to not have adverse impacts on the finance and insurance industry, obviously hugely important to our state economy. So that's something we're going to continue to have conversations about as to how we can move that forward. But the biggest thing is obviously when you look at doing something like this, you cannot have unintended consequences and you can't add uncertainty to the economy and the market. So those are going to be top of mind as we have those conversations. With regards to carbon pipelines and the eminent domain issues and limitations, we're seeing that move specifically in the House. But one of the things we have to watch carefully is that by doing it specifically for carbon pipelines, there is not unintended consequences for other infrastructure deployment and acquisition. Obviously, we do this a lot when you're looking at water and wastewater and energy and electrical and fiber and any other utilization and deployment of infrastructure that we're seeing throughout the city and our rural communities. So that's something you really have to be careful of, is how do you possibly look at having these limitations only specifically for these specific sorts of infrastructure projects without adversely impacting other major infrastructure deployments. The last thing that I want to touch on is the caucus. Obviously, we're starting to see some candidates come into the state, especially on the Republican side, being that the Dems did strip Iowa of their first in the nation status, but we are starting to see candidates come through. But one thing I really want to touch on the Dem side is that we're really pushing as a chamber alliance to have the Dems keep their caucus schedules for 2024. Yes, we could potentially lose delegates if President Biden does run, though. Obviously, there's really only one individual that would be visiting out of the Democratic field. So it's not really going to harm us that much if we hold strong and continue to have those caucuses on schedule. But the biggest thing we're going to make sure that we want to do, and we've had conversations as much as with Ross when he was running the Dems, and Rita now, to Scott, who is also serving as the liaison for the state of Iowa during those caucus discussions at the DNC, but also with Chairman Kaufman and on the Republican side. We're going to do everything we can as chambers, and we should be doing everything we can as communities and active business community and institutional leaders to make sure that we're making the Republican caucus go off without a hitch, and it's the best caucus ever. Because if we're able to do that, that's going to be an easier sell for us to look at after 2024 to show that Iowa stands ready to continue to showcase the first in the nation status as a caucus, and that we not only do it right, but we also look at it through a lens in which we're going to pick a great candidate on both sides of the aisle for the Democrats and Republicans. So one thing I can promise is that we here locally at the Council Bluffs Chamber will do everything we can to try to showcase whichever candidates are coming through town, because we really want this to go off without a hitch and be done as great as possible because of the huge economic impact these caucuses are to the state of Iowa and our local communities. So with that, before I wind up or end this video, I want to make sure that I just touch on, you all saw that our legislative reception was canceled due to the inclement weather, postponed due to the inclement weather from the 15th. We have found a date to reschedule it to, and we're rescheduling Leadership Council Bluffs Government Day to March 29th as well. Additional information will be sent out about that. It's a little later in the session, but there will be obviously some key issues such as property tax being discussed at those times, as well as government consolidation and other key policy issues that we'll be looking at in the last month of session. So watch for additional information on that new date for our legislative reception. Same time, same place. It's just on March 29th rather than February 15th. So with that, I will wind up this week's legislative update. We thank you all very much for your continued support of the Council Bluffs Area Chamber of Commerce. Have a nice rest of the day.